CineD, your digital cinema tech resource, supported by B&H and CVP.
Welcome everybody to this CineD video with Gerald Undone on the other side of the globe. How are you?
Hey, I'm well. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Good, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time. And also with me here is Gunther Machu, who is our lab test expert doing all the scientific camera tests. Thank you, Gunther, for coming.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Actually, we initiated this call with Gerald and Gunther to talk about the methodology behind the lab tests, the dynamic range tests that we do. Because there's a lot of emotion, I would say, going around when people talk about testing cameras, right? Because it feels like everybody wants to save their investment. When they hear that the dynamic range of their camera is not what they expected it to be, they sometimes get very, very upset. So, it's almost like a religious thing at some point. Yeah. So the thing was, Gerald is doing a lot of dynamic range tests. We have been doing them for many, many years. People are sometimes saying, why, is he having different results from us than us, which is like not even true that much, but people don't look at the results that closely. I just wanted a general discussion about that whole subject to clarify, why do we do these tests? Why are they necessary when manufacturers say that a camera has X amount of stops of dynamic range anyway? And how do we do them? And why do we think they are the way we do them and the way you do them, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, basically, thanks for having me. Also, thanks, Gerald, for being here. I think it's a very interesting subject to talk about, dynamic range in general, because at least for me, I mean, looking at all the science behind it and everything, it's still sort of a very vague statement what actually the dynamic range of a camera really is, because there's so many things influencing it. No? And so I think it's a nice idea to have some discussions. Maybe some of our audience also can learn a little bit about the basic concepts of what we're talking about. And also maybe we can basically accomplish that there's a better understanding of the various influencing factors, also what can influence a dynamic range result. And I mean, what was your motivation, Gerald, to actually start these tests there? Because I mean, for us, it was clear we are hearing, like Nino said, the camera manufacturer is claiming this and that amount of stops. And then we were curious and started to do our own tests to basically put that into perspective and also compare the different cameras.
It was actually the same thing for me. When I started doing camera reviews, several years ago, there was only a few channels, I think, that were doing camera reviews, especially that had somewhat of a focus on video. And so I didn't really know how to model the review structure, like what components needed to be covered and what was important, what wasn't. So I started by just talking about things that I was using it for. And then I would look at the comments. And so maybe my initial reviews would only have a few, maybe like some handling and some basic quality things or reasons why I chose it or, what I like. And then people would comment and say that we're planning on getting that camera. Oh, what about this? What about that? What about this port? What does this sound like? How does it do that? And so I just kept, the next time I would do a video, I would take the ones that had recurring comments and put that in the next camera review. By the end of it, it felt like there was just, 40, 50 things that have been requested to go into every review. And I feel like probably because of what you guys were doing with the dynamic range tests, I got a lot of requests because I would do things somewhat scientifically. I emphasize somewhat there, that people were saying, oh, since you're one of the more, technical channels, you should add dynamic range tests into the mix as well. And so I did a lot of research on how does one test dynamic range, in an effective way and that kind of thing. And of course, I had already been in communication with DSC Labs, and I noticed that, they have a chart for it. And I was like, I've seen this before, this name. And then I looked it up, and then your website came up. It's like, oh, right, yeah, because they use the same thing. And so then I read, I think Gunther put a blog or something up that was how you test dynamic range. And so I actually tried my best to emulate that for the sake of providing results that would be useful, because I noticed that a lot of the cameras that you tested, I noticed that there was a lot of non-overlap if you will. At that point, you had tested a lot of cine cameras and maybe a couple more consumer grade cameras. And I had a lot of reviews of consumer cameras. So I thought, well, maybe if I can do the dynamic range test on them, I can sort of fill out the, and then collectively between the two of us, we would have a bigger catalog. But to speak to the first point of our results being incompatible or dissimilar, that is not true anymore. But there was a period when I was first doing this on the first couple cameras where I was always getting about half a stop better results than you were, Gunther. And so just so people are aware, we're not competing or anything like that. I reached out, I think it was on Twitter or something, or maybe you reached out to me, I'm not sure. But we spent a while looking at like all the variables to find out, well, what's going on differently? How are we getting different results? And we eventually figured, it was a setting somewhere in ImaTest probably that, a box that wasn't checked that. So once I checked that, then we had pretty much exactly the same structure to our software, and then the results were within a tenth of a stop, pretty consistently after that. I would say anything from a tenth to a fifth is just variability, and you can ignore that. But so that's it. I stole your entire format. That's how I got to where we are.
No, not really. I mean, I think it's good if other people like independently do these tests, and you also add a lot of different data points to the picture, no? Because you would also test this mode and this mode and that mode and that mode, whereas I'm a little bit more lazy, to be honest, and I would just use the most promising mode, like the log profile with the highest bit rate or so. And
we always try to get the best results out of the camera, and that's it, because we know, or we think, that all the other modes in the camera are probably just down-res versions of that top mode in most cases. I mean, it's now getting a little bit more complicated with camera that record in H.265 or H.264 ProRes, blah blah blah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have noticed that the reason why I guess to answer that for a common question, the reason why I also do the 4K oversampled test is that I've noticed that at least my audience does that. It's always a 4K timeline for my audience. So I thought, okay, I'll give you the number that is, maybe the 6K open gate or whatever the camera's max output is. I'll give you that number, and then I'll throw it in a 4K timeline and maybe put a little sauce on it and see what the end result is, to give you kind of like, this is sort of like your optimum number for what you, my audience, is likely to do with it, and then that way we can compare that as well. But my baseline number usually matches CineD, and then I try to provide something maybe a little bit more tailored to my audience, which is also in an effort to remind people from time to time that there are processes that are available in post that do improve the image quality. So let's not get so upset if your camera scored a third of a stop worse than another camera. It's like, just throw some noise reduction on it and move on with your day, Like,
yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but our aim was always to get as close as possible to the real technical capability of a sensor, right?
Exactly.
Because that's like everything is kind of diluted by everything that the camera does after the image is actually captured, right?
Yes, you have the sensor, you have the image pipeline, you have the codecs.
Exactly.
And so what we get at the end of the day is just a result of processing through all these steps. No?
And very many cameras actually use the same sensor without people being aware of it, because there's not many sensor manufacturers out there. So you will have a lot of Nikon or whatever cameras that actually use Sony sensors. And then you can actually tell, well, this is most likely the sensor from that Sony camera because same resolution, blah, blah, blah.
That's one of the best jokes in this whole scene is, this is not a conversation we have to go too deep into, but it gives me a slight platform to complain about something. The comments I hate the most are the ones that say, oh, I don't like the Sony whatever. It looks too digital and not cinematic or not filmic. And then they'll compare it to another camera. And in my head, I'm thinking, that's the same sensor. So if your image is looking too digital, but you think the other one isn't, it's what you're doing with it, how you're shooting it, how you're lighting it, how you're grading it. But there's no too digital sensor when we're talking about the difference between the same Sony sensor and 3 different cameras. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a gamma curve, and then...
Of course, the gamma curve, that's it, right? Like Sony, people often don't like the Sony colors, and it's gotten a little bit better with S-Cinetone and all that kind of stuff, but and the Venice colors, of course. But yeah, we get that a lot as well.
But it's like you said, they're all made by they're all the same sensor made in the same plant somewhere. So it's like,
that's right.
Many of them, at least.
Yeah.
So let's talk about noise. I mean, because I think I feel like manufacturers are free to claim whatever they want in terms of dynamic range, because they just say, well, for us, this amount of noise is still acceptable, when in reality, it's not acceptable in most cases, right? I mean, we define something, you defined as something years ago, which we perceived as a acceptable limit for the noise floor, which differs from what manufacturers claim, right?
Yeah. And I mean, of course, that's obviously due to the fact that every manufacturer tries to show his camera in the best light possible. So you have camera manufacturers that would show the absolute number of patches that could be still identified. We have some camera manufacturers that show this number of stops at a signal to noise ratio of 1. But the question is if that is still usable. And that's why we came up with this series of tests. But I think before we talk about noise, let's quickly talk about dynamic range. That's also something, Gerald, probably you get a lot in your comments. The dynamic range is a ratio, yeah? And it's not an absolute number of stops, because when we look at a waveform or so, people always ask, why didn't you count that stop or that stop? It's really a range, and it's simplistically defined as the ratio of the maximum and minimum luminance that a camera can capture. And the maximum luminance, that's quite clear. I mean, you all see when a camera is clipping the signal. But the difficult part is, and here's where noise kicks in, is what is still acceptable at the minimum luminance level in the shadows.
I think that there's a one little caveat to that, though, which I believe that causes confusion with some, which is that it's also concurrently, because when people have different methods of exposure or different methods of how they analyze things, dynamic range, my understanding anyway, especially from an audio world, which uses the same sort of terminology, is that it's concurrent at any one slice in time. What's the maximum? I don't know what the simple term would be, but like if people like to use the word contrast and stuff like that. But if we're talking from the brightest to the darkest at any given time, that can be perceived, because you can manipulate images. And with HDR and with phones and with everything these days, they're not occurring at the same time. That's the key of it, right? And the thing that you mentioned, by the way, about manufacturer claims, I should have added to the previous thing when you asked me what's the other reason to get into it, is that often I don't try to provide much subjectivity to my reviews, because I don't really care what camera person buys or what they like to shoot or whatever. But for me, it's more of just, let's find out if the manufacturers are telling the truth or not. And reading your blog of like how to test dynamic range seemed like a way to provide a validation step, which
exactly.
I feel like you said, is missing. But what's interesting, as you just pointed out, is that when you do analyze, you can either do it visually and look at it and how many patches can you see, or if you throw out an imatest, it normally offers you sort of like the overall slope-based dynamic range score or whatever. Sometimes I find that those coincide with what the manufacturer is saying, which makes me think that the manufacturer is just saying, this is how many visible above black stops there are, regardless of the quality. So I still use that to say, well, they didn't lie. You know what I mean? Like if those numbers, then I'll actually call them out and say, I'm not getting anything close to what's going on. But with the last couple of cameras, I've said, whoever it was, Canon said 15, and we look and we go, oh, okay, yeah, well, there is 15 sort of there, and let's see what we can pull out of it. But I think what's interesting about that is I think both of us, except for your latitude test, which we can talk about afterwards, but I think both of us kind of look at, what's the most usable within that? But the confusion in the comments that you asked about was that people will say, well, you should do an over and under exposure, or you should do this and you should do that. That isn't exactly dynamic range, because it has to occur simultaneously and in a single frame. So this is where I think, I don't know, perhaps if you want to discuss it further, but this is where I think that a lot of the confusion comes from is, well, what is it? Why don't you lift the shadows? Or what's it like when you recover the highlights and stuff? And it's like, well, yes and no, but here's the thing. If we exposed with nothing clipping in the frame, how many stops are occurring simultaneously? That's the dynamic range. And a lot of tests that I've seen on the internet, excluding your latitude test, but other people's versions of your latitude tests, completely ignore the principle of what is occurring concurrently, which is what dynamic range actually is, and not can you push-pull the camera. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Yeah, and I think that the dynamic range measurement or also capturing something like close to this, I think it's also so emotional because it's regarded as one of the most important features of the camera. But in reality, actually, we should also put that a little bit into perspective. I mean, of course, we're talking about dynamic range now, but basically that's just one out of many pieces of the puzzle of a camera. No?
Right.
Then you start to compare also, like you say, you should look simultaneously at what the camera can capture. There are so many tests out there. By design, they are flawed already, but then people start to claim, oh, but this guy said that, and this guy said that, and he's very well respected, and he's that. So I think to bring some objectivity to the table and really have something where the filmmaking community can compare and get a benchmark or an independent baseline, I think that's very valuable. And I'm glad actually that you are also using a very similar methodology. And as you said, we are within 1% of the results. So people can really go and say, okay, let's have a look at the additional data points that Gerald is providing. So I think that's great.
Right.
Let me just chime in here, because you said before that half jokingly, that you did less tests than Gerald because you're more lazy.
Yeah.
The real reason is why we only do really 3 tests, right? I mean, it's dynamic range, it's latitude, it's rolling shutter. Did I forget anything? No. I mean, those 3. And the reason is because those are the only ones that we can make consistently with every camera that we get into the house.
Yes.
There is no other test you can do. At least I haven't identified one which you can do repeatedly without, a lot more effort.
Yes.
Because what do you need for the latitude test is a completely dark room, a Xyla chart, which is behind me here, and then all the post-processing and early analysis that you do. And the same for the latitude test. You just need to run through all those different exposures. And that's it. I mean, basically, and then
you also have a consistent scene, which is specially designed with the highlights and the shadows. But
exactly, that needs to be consistent, but it needs to be the same kind of thing.
Exactly.
And all the other things, I mean, what else is there, right? I mean, what else? You could do the same for audio, I guess, but we're not an audio website. But in terms of, we just care about the image quality and the technical capabilities of a sensor. Exactly for those things that are captured in one moment in time. That means no post noise reduction applied, no HDR double, triple exposures applied like phones do and so on, like you said, Gerald. Just that. And that's not so easy, and it's getting harder every day because the cameras add a lot more trickery to everything they do with every generation. So it's even, like if you look at a phone, it's like almost impossible to do the same kind of thing on a phone because a phone will always do post-processing.
Have you gotten requests for dynamic range tests for phones? I've gotten requests for it, and I was like, I don't even know how I would approach that because you can't control the phone. It does what it wants to do, and the results, I should actually do one just to see how amazing the results are. You get like 20 stops, crystal clear, whatever. I bet you the results are absurd,
That's the thing. I mean, it's, but normal professional, or at least the semi-professional cameras are going in that direction as well.
Yeah.
Where, you can't turn off the noise reduction internally anymore. I remember the first generation of the Panasonic S1H. I think I don't know how many stops it showed because there was always noise reduction applied, even when you switched it off. And you
before they added the -1.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Which is 0, right?
Yeah. And there's still something going on.
There's still something going on. Yeah.
Even with -1.
And of course. I mean, and then people get religious. And like one thing I wanna address before we go into more detail with the noise and everything is like a lot of people, not a lot, but some people, and that really upsets me when I read that, call us out in comments for being bought by XYZ manufacturer. It's always a different one because we will always analyze a new camera and then, the result will not be what the manufacturer claimed. And then the latest example would be the R5C, which apparently didn't meet everybody's expectations, and everybody meaning the people who bought that camera. So, and then people call you out like, oh, like you're bought by Sony. It's like, it's ridiculous. I mean, like if people saw how we operate as a site, there would be no question at all anymore. Because, I mean, we have had discussions, don't get me wrong, with manufacturers in the past. I'm not naming names, but where we did actually analyze a camera, it didn't fulfill what the manufacturer claims. Although in our assessment, in your assessment, we are always very fair and balanced, right? We say that this is with a signal to noise ratio of 2 applied. This is with, when we look at it this way, right? So it's not like you, Gerald. We're not out there to upset anybody, right? We're just trying to find the truth. And we have had companies before who have said, almost threatened to do something about it. But then actually in all of those cases, the engineering departments were in direct contact with us. Yes. Every single time we have talked to the top guys in Japan, most of them are in Japan, and you've dealt with them. And at the end of the day, they kind of all had to confirm it. Yeah. There was not a single time, not one time where something was wrong in that regard, right? And the cool thing is, and I have to say that, and that is something, it's a broad statement, but it's something that's, I think, true for all the Japanese camera manufacturers particularly. They are very engineering driven to different degrees, right? Yes. You have, they do what's possible because the engineers come up with something. And I feel like in most cases, the marketing department follows their lead, which is good because they accept when something is not the way it was claimed, right? So it's not like there's any bad blood or anything. They will. That's also Japanese mentality, right? They will accept this and they will thank you for that, for pointing it out, right? And that's the cool reaction. But of course, there were cases where the marketing people were like, "Oh, like we have an advertising package with you," and like, "Yeah, well, our advertising department doesn't even talk to Gunther, like there's no connection whatsoever. Right. Like it's fine. I don't care if they advertise with us. It's never happened. Never has anybody canceled anything because of that. It doesn't make any sense, right? Because they know that they can't influence their test in any way, right?
I was going to say there is a surprising mentality to camera owners that I've always thought works against them to a certain extent, which is that if you own a camera and you're happy with it, probably don't watch my video on it, or maybe don't read the CineD lab test on it, because you have nothing to gain.
Yes, that's a good one. Yeah.
In your lab test does not provide any instructions how to use your camera better. So there's nothing in there for you. It's these tests that if we lump ourselves in together, most of the time, what I think we're both trying to do is for people who are holding their money in their hand and know what their most important 2 or 3 things are to their purchasing decision, and they want to just compare some specs and then think, I think I'd rather put my money in there. But if you own a R5C or a whatever, I don't care.
Sure.
And you're using it and you like it and you're happy with the images, perfect. That was well spent money then. It doesn't matter whether I tell you that it performs slightly worse than another camera from another manufacturer. They probably use different lenses and have a different system and maybe prioritize something else. And maybe you won't even like the way it feels in your hand. So who cares? You're doing perfectly fine. If you tell somebody their camera is slightly worse, then it's like a personal, but slightly worse in a specific category. It's like an affront to the money that they already spent, because I think it triggers sort of a sense of buyer's remorse. And I think as people, we want to feel validated. We want to feel like we've got the best thing. We're in the right group. We're talking to the right people. And because of that strong mental pull, as much as I want the view, I would rather you didn't watch a review of a product you already own. Watch the guide or the tutorial, or if I post a video that's like, here's how to get slightly better color or whatever out of your camera. Watch that. That's useful. Don't watch the review, it's just going to upset you.
Yes, yes. You know what was funny? I was a super big fan of my original Lumix GH1, and I've used it for many years, and I really liked it. I still have it, by the way. And when the GH6 came out, I was like, okay, let's have a little fun comparison. And I also ran the GH1 through the lab test, and you know what? The GH1 had 8 usable stops. And I loved it for many years. Yeah, and now I'm like, okay, this camera has 12 stops or 13 stops. It's like, how was I ever able to shoot anything on the GH1? Yeah.
But that's the thing. I mean, we always, because of those tests, of course, I mean, we ourselves and the audience believes that those are the most important things. But you said it before, they're not. I mean, they're aspects of a camera which are important, but they're definitely not the most important ones. Sure. Because in theory,
I have a question for you though. If you did have to rank some aspects, I personally would rank dynamic range quite high on my list of, if I had to make a list of important features for me, if I was buying a camera, I would say it's one of the more important features that I would care about. What about you?
Absolutely, but the thing is, it depends on your use case, right? Because if you're a documentary shooter, you will have different needs than somebody who's shooting commercials in a studio. And I think actually the whole usability of a camera in everyday life is a lot more important.
It is.
It's like if I have the best, let's say, whatever, let's say I'm shooting events and all I have available is an Alexa XT, which is probably not the case, but let's say, it's very big and heavy. It has, one of the best sensors out there, but, it's not practical because it's big and heavy. I'd rather use the one with less dynamic range and just be able to actually get more shots.
I guess I was asking more of the objective scientific test, because yes, there's a lot of subjective aspects that are the most important. It's just hard to quantify those sometimes. Exactly. When I tell somebody, like, I do my best to say, if you have big hands, this camera's big, but like, it's hard to say whether you're gonna like holding the camera and using it, or whether the menu's gonna feel clumsy to you. Or there's design language too, where sometimes the menu works with your brain and sometimes it doesn't, and somebody tells you the menu sucks and you go, I like that menu. So it's hard to, those things are hard. But when it comes to the ones that, as you mentioned, that Gunther can actually test repeatedly, the ones that you do test are pretty darn important in my opinion. Rolling shutter and dynamic range are huge. If ever you're just running around with a camera, those ones show up right away if they're lacking.
Exactly. No, definitely. I mean, those are very important aspects of the camera, but you always have to see the complete picture, like Nino said. No? And it was funny because I can confirm, Nino, back then we published a lab test about a camera and it didn't fare well. And like 1 week later, you bought that camera because you said that's the perfect camera.
No, I had it already. It's like I had the, I think it was the FX9 actually. We're looking into an FX9 right now.
Yeah.
And that's my camera. I bought it, like full price, normal price. And because I was an FS7 user for many years and I upgraded. And then Gunther ran the lab test and it wasn't that great actually. The latitude or the dynamic range was on par or actually a little bit worse than the FS7, which was like a 7-year-old camera at the time. So yeah, of course I didn't feel great about it, but what can I do? It's like that's what the science says. I still like the camera. I love the autofocus and, but still, yeah.
You should have put an angry comment on Gunther's post.
Exactly, anonymously, with like me with a mustache.
Yes. Yeah, correct.
No, but what I wanted to say, like we focus on these 3 aspects because those are the only ones that we can compare. And then people look at those lab tests and say, and just, like because of buyer's remorse or because of whatever other reason, don't like what we wrote or do like what we wrote, but they put too much emphasis on it in a way. Like we know it's important. Yes, it is absolutely. Image quality for me also is probably the most important thing I want from a camera, but it's still not everything. Not even by a long shot. So people should just really watch other reviews, watch hands-on reviews. We try to do real-life hands-on reviews with every camera as well, but they are separate from the lab tests, right? They never happen at the same time. They might have happened earlier. They might have happened later. But we do them as well, shooting real stuff in the real world. And then Johnny, most of the times, will give his assessment of what he likes and what he doesn't like of a camera. And I do the same with drones and so on. But that's why we separate those things, because the one thing is really subjective and the other thing is supposed to be very as objective as possible.
Exactly. And I think also one thing that we should mention here, sometimes I get the question, why are you so enthusiastic about this camera in your lab test and you're bashing this other camera or so? I mean, of course, we all try to be, especially with the lab tests, as objective as possible. But on the other hand, I think people also want to know, how would you rate that camera in comparison to others and so on. So I always try to give some comparisons to other cameras and say, okay, it's better than this camera, better than this in that aspect and so on.
You need a benchmark to compare it to.
Somehow. But of course, the problem with the ever-growing list of cameras, I mean, what do you compare it to? There's so many things out there. And of course, if I mention a Sony as a comparison, then I'm biased towards Sony or something. I think that's bullshit. And it's a difficult thing. And there's so many things that can go wrong in this dynamic range testing. I mean, I don't know how you felt, Gerald, when I first opened this ImaTest software. I mean, there's thousands of boxes you can tick, and
it's so unintuitive too. Yeah.
Wow.
I wanted it to be, I open it up and there's like a progress bar and a run dynamic range button is what I wanted. I press it and it runs it, but instead I was like, okay, so we want a step chart. Then you go into step chart is one of 30 buttons. And then you go in there and there's just so many settings, and half of them I don't even know what they mean. And so I was lucky enough to find, Xyla 21, I have one of those. You know, and you like dropping it down, and then, but yeah, it's a ridiculous piece of software. And then even when you run it, like you probably have to do something similar. Here's a little inside baseball joke, but when you expose the Xyla 21 correctly, you can't see the dark stops. So I have to make a template file first where I use my phone's flashlight and I crank up the ISO so that I can, and so the flashlight is shining on the dark spots, the dark patches, and I have the camera the sensitivity turned up really high so that I can see all 21, and I'll record that, and then I'll put the phone in my pocket, put the settings back and record that so that when I bring it into ImaTest, I can run the template file first so that I can correctly put the boxes on each of the patches.
On the other hand, what's great about ImaTest is it's just a mathematical calculation tool.
For people who are familiar with that, it runs off of MATLAB's libraries, basically, and runtimes.
Correct. But what the good thing about it is it gives you a mathematical representation of each stop. It calculates the signal value, it calculates the noise value. That's what you get. And then you can calculate the signal to noise ratio. I mean, it gives you that in the results. And that's just very handy because this is what it is. It's just a mathematical calculation of the signal to noise ratios of each of the stops. And then that's what you get. And then you're left to say, am I still fine with the signal to noise ratio of 1? Is it usable? Or can we only use the signal to noise ratio of 2? And I think here one thing was very interesting that also struck me when I did the first tests. ARRI, for instance, which is sort of the benchmark for cinema cameras, they always claim that their sensors have 14 plus stops. And actually, when you run the ARRI Alexa Classic through ImaTest, and I did it now 5 years later again, just for fun, you get 13.8 stops at signal to noise ratio of 2. So it's actually the signal to noise ratio of 2 is what ARRI actually says is the dynamic range of their cameras.
And by the way, I had a conversation about exactly that. Yeah. We were just in Munich at their headquarters 3 weeks ago for the EuroCine Expo, and they invited a lot of people to their new headquarters, and there was like a tour through the manufacturing. I've never been there before, the new one. Very impressive. And we talked to one of their top guys in the camera development, and he said exactly that. It's like there's a constant fight. It's like their marketing department also would want to say well, actually, we are that much better. Yeah. But because they know how trusted their results are and how many of the top DPs in the world use them, they don't want to overstate that at all. They always are on the more conservative side with anything they do, apparently. That's also true for even the drop tests and all those crazy things they put those cameras through. I mean, we saw they put hammers on that. I mean, it's insane. Like most of the other cameras would just break. I mean, they are super expensive. Yeah. They are super exclusive. But I was very impressed by that. Like when their engineers say this is usable, this is what you can say, this is what they will put on the box. Yeah. And it's not something where exactly what we talked about before, where they try to stretch it in any way or shape or form.
Which is why I think you using the ARRI as like the benchmark in most of your comparisons, where you say, just for reference, I think that's fair to do and a good call, because.
And there's also one interesting thing there. I mean, you may have noticed that as well, that with different modes, like of recent cameras, you have raw mode. It maybe if you run it through ImaTest, you get less dynamic range, and if you have like an lock mode with internal H.265 recording, you get a much better dynamic range. No? With the ARRI Mini LF, for instance, we were able to record ARRI RAW and ProRes, and it has the same values.
Which means there's no noise reduction occurring, right?
There's no noise reduction. I mean, for sure, there's always some sort of noise reduction in the image processing going on. But you see that's super consistent. No matter if you use ARRI RAW, if you use ProRes HQ on that camera, it gives you the same numbers on ImaTest. And that's interesting. So we have this consistency of what ARRI is claiming and what the ImaTest gives us in terms of signal-to-noise ratio of 2 and even 1. And I think that's a nice thing, because that can serve as sort of a benchmark also for other cameras out there. And of course, what this brings across is also a lot of cameras, and we discussed this before, Gerald, are using internal noise reduction that you cannot turn off and so on. And then, of course, naturally, you will get a better value at the signal-to-noise thresholds that we use, like signal-to-noise ratio of 1 and signal-to-noise ratio of 2, like phones do, for instance, and many other recent cameras. Yeah, and that brings me to the latitude test. We wanted to have a real-world test, but in a controlled environment in our standard CineD studio scene, where we could also see how a camera reacts to overexposure and underexposure, and if we bring it back to a base exposure level, and then see how do these numbers stack up for the different cameras, and also if some of the cameras that fare very well in our lab test also show that behavior in the latitude test. The ARRI Alexa Mini LF shows 10 stops of exposure latitude, and it shows 5 stops above and 5 stops below, and you can push it back to the base exposure that we set at 60% luma value at the forehead of our subject. And all other cameras are way below that. Yeah? For instance, a camera that shows 12 stops at a signal-to-noise ratio of 2 would have around 8 stops in the exposure latitude. The ARRI Alexas that show 14 stops, 2 more, show 10 stops of exposure latitude. So the good thing about this one is it also gives another perspective how you can expose the camera and what is the real or the dynamic range in a controlled but real scene.
Would you say that's more of a real world test? Because in reality, of course, sometimes you would have to deal with over or underexposed images, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's really a real world test, but very controlled and also carefully designed. So how we put the lights, also what is the distance from the subject to the background, how far are the shadows exposed, how many stops are they below the forehead, when are the highlights clipping, and all that things. So I think that's another very important test for that. And I think we should discuss that, because you mentioned that you tried something similar, but you didn't have good results, or you have some doubts.
No, what it is that I've been a critic of latitude tests across the internet. Not specifically this. I would actually argue that yours is the best in terms of utility, because it does seem to correlate with the dynamic range results that you get from ImaTest, which means that, the correlation is just a correlation, but it does indicate that there's a conclusion to draw from that. But I would say, if I can speak more generally then, not to lump you in with just everybody else, but I find that often latitude tests provide misleading information, because there's a lot of operations, as you already mentioned, that go on in a camera that have an impact. For instance, some of the earlier Sony cameras have a really sort of funky compression that they do as well, which is going to have a huge impact on that latitude test. But my issue more, I think, with it is that, one, usually when we start to get into the fuzzy issues, is that you're over and under exposing to a very strong degree. And why is anybody doing that? Why is anybody 3 or more stops over or under? You really messed up to be in that kind of territory. 1 to 2 stops, I would say, I guess for me, it's more of a check mark. Can the camera recover 1 to 2 stops? Yes, then it's fine. If you're splitting hairs between this one can do 4, this one can do 5, learn how to use the camera. It's kind of where where I come in on that. But also, my issue is that it's not representative of a problem that actually needs to be solved often. And I would love to make a test. I have this idea to build maybe like a what do you call them? Like a tableau or a diorama or something. I'd like to be able to build something so that it's static and the same that I use to emulate the closest thing that I do to a push-pull test. But mine's variable. I can't go from camera to camera with it. I can only do it on a given camera. But what I'll do sometimes is I will go to my window and I'll kind of bring the curtain that blocks the light and I'll shoot outside the window and inside at me at the same time. And then I'll raise my exposure level until it looks pleasing enough and makes sense. And also try to recover the highlights outside and make a balanced shot. And some cameras can do this exceptionally well and some can't. And that's the reason why I said dynamic range is really important, because those are things that actually happen. If you're somebody that shoots interiors or interviews or corporate videos or real estate or any kind of walkthroughs, like then there's issues where you have windows in the shot, but you also have darker interiors and you need to sort of balance out that exposure. I would love to make not a big environment like you guys do with your latitude test because that'd be too much, but like a small little thing where I can put the camera in a fixed position and it shoots into like a little set, right? And in the mini set, there's maybe like a light that comes in and maybe I put a little action figure in there, but also have like a color chart and a grayscale thing. And then we can just do it over and over again and have it where the light that usually hits the action figure is generally overexposed, but over in the corner, maybe I occlude it with like a piece of foam board or something. So over in the corner where the color chart is, it's too dark. And so then in post, you can almost put a line down the middle. And on the right side, you can increase the exposure on the color chart, but reduce the exposure on the action figure. And you could do this with all cameras. And then you could have a still image of that and say, look at the skin tone on the action figure and look at the noisy color chart, how the colors are preserved. And you could run the vector scope. I'd love to build something like that. But as far as I know, there's no test like that exists on the internet. So yours is the best thing that we have currently. But do you see my issue of it's not occurring concurrently and nobody should be recovering 4+ stops in either direction? I'm curious if you agree on any of that.
No, I mean, basically you're right. I mean, you would never, you're a DP, you would never overexpose by 5 stops and then try to recover the image in post, or underexpose by 5 stops or whatever. Totally right. And that's not so much I think the main message of the test. The main message is really, how does the combination of sensor, image processing pipeline, and codec represent all the areas in my standard studio scene when I over and underexpose it? And one thing that could be a real-world scenario, of course, like you mentioned, you have a window in the frame and stuff like that, and you still try to get a good skin color on the subject. Then you would also rely on a certain ratio, again, the dynamic range of the camera from the light outside there and the luma value or the luminance on the actor's skin or face. And then you would also be interested, if that is a large range, then you would have to probably raise that face again also and push it up, but probably only 1-2 stops or so. No, I totally agree on that, but this is really the torture test, to test where are the limits of the camera.
Torture test is a great word for it because they always seem to fall apart at a certain point.
It's a torture test and it really shows how far a camera can be pushed. And that's similar to the dynamic range or the Xyla chart that we have in the background. It just gives you a range, a ratio, and it gives some information how far you can push a shadow, for instance, while still having an overexposure as well.
The challenge we have with cameras is that because there are so many hidden functions, if you will, in the pipeline, like you said, that what I wish that we could do, well, I don't know. Maybe, you know what? Sometimes I wish there was a debug menu on a camera that you could turn on for the sake of testing. Because take your latitude test, let's call it a torture test for the rest of this thing. If you go to your -4 on the torture, -4 shooting to bring back up to 0, and the image falls apart, is it because the noise reduction was blocky? Is it because the compression presented artifacts? Is it because the color the bit depth is too minimal for the amount of hues being represented in that particular gamut that you chose? it's hard to say all you know is the image is ugly when you recover it, and you do your best to analyze it, which again is why I think that your torture test is a valid data point and should continue to exist. I give you permission to continue doing.
Thank you. It's a lot of work.
But no, I think, yeah, exactly. I think that your descriptions, you do your best to look at it, compare it to how you've seen other cameras, and draw conclusions. But it's hard to tell, and that's the reason why I'm not a huge fan of other videos I've seen where we just do a quick, like, let's slide this and slide that and make a conclusion. It's like, I don't know what's causing that. I don't know what bit depth you shot in. I don't know how you exposed. I don't know where middle gray was. I don't know anything. So telling me that, like, it in the other videos, you know what I mean? So yeah, push-pull is what people call them a lot. Frustrate me because there's so many things, especially one of the more popular cameras is probably a Sony these days, right? And Sony has so many little operations going on.
Yeah.
Every time that image comes, that I don't know what's breaking it apart. And do you remember the 8-bit cameras when people would shoot log on the 8-bit cameras? If you had to push the color, that something would go weird with the skin tones. And so I learned how to shoot those those 8-bit Sony cameras and made videos of, like, this is how you get good results. But if you deviate from that, the images would go weird.
Exactly.
And it's more there's a lot going on that causes that, I guess is my point. And because you test so many cameras, the cameras that you test have different bit depths, have different compression ratios, have different codecs, have that. It's an impossible job. And if we go back to the commenters again, don't be upset if Gunter says this one has better latitude than the other one, because there's so many things going on in the camera that if you shoot, generally though, what I can say is almost every camera today, if you shoot within ±1, your image is going to look great. It's going to look great on, like, every camera that has come out in the last, like, 2 years.
The funny thing also is I always tell people the less money you spend on the camera, generally speaking, the better you have to be as a shooter. Because the more expensive it is, the higher the bit depth is, the more you can recover, right? Because you have to really expose correctly, especially with an 8-bit camera, as you said, because, you know, it's just gone. There's nothing there anymore if you over or underexpose, especially when you overexpose with many of those cameras. So, you know, like, I mean, actually, in theory, not like if you've ever used an RE camera or even some of the Reds, I mean, especially the REs, they are the easiest things to operate as well. I mean, There's not many bells and whistles on there. Like, the menus are super clean. There's not much to choose from. There's ISO, there's shutter speed.
There's like 6 buttons.
Exactly, that's about it. And you can't go wrong. I mean, that's the thing.
You can underexpose it, overexpose it. You can always recover. No, not always, but.
But yeah, it's like, in general, of course you do, and that, you know, goes back to the quality of a sensor kind of thing, which is why it is so important. You know, like, because it has such a good image processing and sensor, you always, not always, but you more easily get good results, right?
Yeah.
But, you know, that's a great point to sort of jump into one thing about noise, if you'll allow me. You said sometimes you're shooting in moonlight, whatever. So sometimes you have a noisy shot. That's just how it just exists, right? What I've been noticing recently, and I think the Fuji is a great topic for this because that was your most recent lab test on the XH2S, right? We haven't actually spoken of this because, again, Gunter and I actually message quite a bit. So if ever I get a camera that Gunter hasn't, like, posted his lab test yet, I'll be like, does this seem right to you? Like, if like the numbers are different or something. Noise can have a quality that affects not only how it looks, that's subjective though, whether you like it or not, but also how it seems noise reduction works to it. I found that the new Fuji, the reason why I was so sort of enthusiastic about it was that not only when it was noisy, did it look good to me, but that noise reduction, at least in Resolve, it's like it had some secret language between Resolve and the noise where it just knew how to just, like, clean all the noise up better than I've seen any other, like, without so much ease. I've never seen post-processing just be like, nah, there's no more noise anymore, and you can barely tell that it affected your image. I tried to show in my video, I had like a spider web that didn't even lose any detail when I took all the noise away, and I couldn't understand it. So there's something about the way the noise is generated too that some sensors have an advantage. What did you find that with the Fuji?
Now that's exactly what we noticed as well. The noise has a very fine appearance and it looks very organic. I mean, I've also mentioned it in the lab test. Now you can underexpose it by 4 stops and don't even have to use noise reduction. It still looks good now. So that's absolutely the case. And I think that this is why a latitude test is also so important, because it just shows you an image. And no matter what is going on in the camera, if there's noise reduction ongoing or whatever the codec is doing with blocky noise or blocky patches of this and that, or if the codec is breaking apart, with the latitude test and you raise those shadows, judge for yourself. You just see it and you can see this doesn't look good anymore. No? And I think this is what I like so much about it. It sort of levels out the playing field, because it's not about setting the camera to this or this or that. You just use the best available codec, the best available like log profile or whatever. And then that's what you get. That's it. And you can use noise reduction in post to try to save the image. If the noise is very blocky, you cannot save it. Like you say, if you have a very fine grain, like with the XH2S, you can very easily use noise reduction on it and it still looks good. And I think that's important. Those are the data points that we need.
So I think what you're trying to say is that you've been bought and paid for by Fuji. Is that correct?
Yes.
They now own.
I just wanted to say that. I just wanted to say, Gerald, I'm really happy that your results of that camera are good, because people would call us out like crazy on this one, because we just ran a huge competition with Fuji, with their marketing people, giving away 10 of those cameras, right?
Yeah, if I was like, this camera has bad dynamic range, and then you were like, it's got great dynamic range, they'd be like, these Fuji shills.
We were nervous about hearing from, I mean, we've been nagging Gunther for weeks now. When do we get the results for this test? Because of course, like, you know, we would have to just tell the truth as always, but of course it would look great when you just gave away 10 of those cameras, like suddenly, well, it's not great, but I'm happy that it is. I mean, they seem to have tried to really make a camera that is a good B cam, and that is what they told us when they presented it to us at NAB before it was announced. A B cam for big cameras, right? Because Fuji really they don't have any, the cool thing about Fuji is they don't have any market to protect in the higher end. There is nothing that prevents them to put their absolute best into the new cameras they make, in my opinion, because they don't have any holy cows to protect, right? They don't have high-end whatever like Sony has, like Canon has, so they can easily do whatever they can and put it into the smallest body they have.
And it's perfect for your lab test, because the rolling shutter is phenomenal on that camera. The dynamic range is great for an APS-C compact body, and it fared quite well in your lab test, like 9 over under. So it's like, it's the perfect camera a perfect APS-C camera for Gunther to run through the gamut with, because it scores exceedingly well. But to Nino's point of what's most important, in terms of APS-C cameras, I think, not counting Super 35, whatever, but like APS-C mirrorless cameras, it's probably the best image quality one that exists currently. But there's a usability aspect, which I personally don't love using the Fuji as much as I do other cameras, just because of the way my brain works. So even though, like, a viewer could ask me, so are you switching to the XH2S now? And my answer is no, just because I don't want to use it. But if I was basing it solely on the image, then yeah, the image is terrific and I should be using it. I probably should be using, I don't know, a C70 or something. You know what I mean? Like I probably should be, but yeah, the usability factor is huge.
I think everybody has preferences in terms of what they're used to. I mean, you know, like if you would ask Johnny, he's a Fuji. He loved the X-T3. He used the X-T4 for everything. He would show up to interviews with other camera manufacturers shooting on the Fuji and all the time. And I'm the same with Sony, just because I'm used to it, or, you know, like because I use it for my commercial work, for documentary work, outside of CineD as well, but that's just personal preference, of course, and everybody brings some kind of bias into tests. But that's the one thing that with those scientific tests, you know, that both you and we do, we can try to get rid of at least that aspect for those kinds of tests, because
And just look at the image.
it's just the image and just the result. So the whole subjectivity there and personal preference doesn't really matter anymore as much as it does for a usability test or a real world test, because then of course you always bring your own bias. I mean, like some people who have never used a Sony camera and use it for the first time will be very confused by the menus. But that's probably true also for people who use a Fuji or a Canon for the first time, or even a Blackmagic. I don't know. Yeah.
No, nobody can be confused using a Blackmagic camera. It's like using a child's toy or whatever.
And that's the one thing that DJI really got right with the Ronin 4D. It's like the menu is so good. It's just so easy. It's like their first menu and it's perfect. Yeah. Well, I wanted to announce kind of like a soft launch here. We're about to launch a new tool on the website we've had in development for a very long time, actually, called databases. I can actually share my screen if you want to see it, Gerald. But essentially what it is it holds data for all the latest cameras, actually all the cameras we can get hold of. And many of those have been lab tested. You see on this green label here every camera that has been in our lab. So when I click on one of them, let's just take the GH6, it would show up here. You see all the basic data from the manufacturer here, which is what we have. But then also we have dynamic range results from our lab tests.
Thanks for showing me. That's cool.
Well, thank you, Gerald. Thanks for taking the time. This was very insightful, I think, and very fun. We should do this again. And if you want to share what camera you are releasing, like what camera review you are releasing next, we can just try to cover the same one.
I don't have any camera reviews pending right now. I was doing something similar. I was trying to get everything done before a certain time. We have a baby on the way.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations.
I figured it'd be in best bet not to not to have a backlog of camera reviews to do that then I end up not getting to. So I'm kind of sort of gearing myself up to I can take time off if I need to,
With a with a 1 year old at home myself, I can tell you that's a very wise decision. Yeah.
Good. Okay. I'm glad to hear it. So nothing forthcoming. But if I do end up with some camera and I'm sure I'll send Gunther a message on Twitter and be like, "Do these results look good to you?" Well, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. It was good to chat with you guys.
All right.
Thank you, Gerald.
And thanks everybody for watching. Stay tuned to Gerald's YouTube channel, our YouTube channel, and CineD.com for more dynamic range tests, camera tests, and so on. Thanks for watching.